The dirt in Blackwood County did not yield easily. It was heavy, black loam soil that choked the plow in the wet months and baked into iron-hard sheets when August rolled around. To the men who tried to tame it, the land felt less like property and more like a quiet, patient adversary waiting for them to break. Arthur Vane knew the taste of that dust before he knew the sound of his own name. Born in the twilight years of the Great Depression, he grew up in the shadow of a sagging red barn that smelled perpetually of dry hay, old diesel, and livestock sweat. His father, Silas Vane, was a taciturn man whose hands resembled cracked oak bark. Silas believed in three things: the King James Bible, the relentless rhythm of the seasons, and the absolute necessity of hard work, even when that work yielded nothing but broken bones and unpaid debt notices from the bank in town. "The ground remembers who bled on it, Arthur," Silas would say, his voice like gravel scraping against a shovel. He was sitting on the weathered porch step, rolling a thin cigarette with fingers that shook from exhaustion. "You give up now, and you ain't just losing 40 acres. You're giving away every drop of sweat me and your grandfather buried under them cornrows." Arthur, just 16 at the time, would stand by the rusted pump handle, looking out over the stunted stalks of corn turning yellow under a merciless sun. He didn't feel reverence for the land. He felt a deep, smoldering hatred for it. He hated the way it turned his mother's hands raw. He hated how it bent his father's spine before the man hit 50. And above all, he hated the quiet, suffocating terror of every autumn, when the crop yields were tallied against the ledger at the county bank. Success in Blackwood County wasn't measured by wealth, it was measured by survival. If you held on to your land for another winter without selling your cattle or mortgaging the house, you were a king. But Arthur didn't want to be a king of dirt and rust. He wanted power over it. He wanted a farm that didn't just survive, but dominated. The crisis came in the autumn of 1968. A brutal early frost struck overnight, turning miles of late-blooming soy into black, ruined mush. Silas had gambled everything on that harvest to pay off the mortgage on the northern pasture. When the sun rose over the white-rimed fields, glowing cold and orange, Silas didn't speak. He walked out to the edge of the field, sat down on a tractor tire, and stared into the tree line for 4 hours. 2 weeks later, his heart simply gave out while he was mending a barbed wire fence in the rain. Arthur stood over his father's grave in the small churchyard behind the Methodist chapel. The wind cut through his thin wool coat, carrying the bitter scent of wood smoke and turning dirt. His mother wept quietly behind her veil, her shoulders trembling under the weight of an uncertain future. The bank representative, a sharp-faced man named Miller who wore polished leather shoes that had never stepped in manure, stood a polite distance away, waiting to discuss terms. As the first shovel of earth hit the wooden casket with a dull, hollow thud, something shifted inside Arthur. The hatred he had carried for the land turned into a cold, calcified determination. He realized that the land had consumed his father because his father had treated it with timid respect. Silas had played defense his entire life, reacting to drought, frost, and market crashes like a dog cowering from thunder. "I won't cower," Arthur thought, watching the dark earth cover the box. "I will break it before it breaks me." He turned away from the grave before the burial was finished and walked back toward Miller. The banker cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. "Arthur, I am deeply sorry for your loss," Miller said, his tone dripping with professional sympathy. "Your father was a good man. But regarding the Northern 40 and the equipment loan, the board meets on Tuesday. If you can't liquidate some of the livestock..." "I'm not selling the livestock," Arthur interrupted. His voice was flat, devoid of grief, devoid of youth. Miller blinked, taken aback. "Son, the debt stands at nearly $8,000. With the harvest gone..." "I'll pay it," Arthur said, stepping closer. Though barely 20, his frame had hardened into the lean, broad-shouldered build of a veteran farmhand. His eyes were gray as lead. "Give me until next November. I'll expand the south acreage into corn, and I'll buy the Miller family's lease on the creek bed." "Buy?" Miller let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "With what capital? The bank won't lend you a dime, Arthur. You're broke." "Then I'll work the night shifts at the rendering plant in Cedar Falls," Arthur replied, his voice chillingly calm. "And I'll run the farm by day. You'll get your money with interest, Miller, but when I pay it, you leave my deeds alone forever." Miller looked at the young man, searching his face for bluster or desperation. He found neither. There was only a terrifying, unyielding iron in the boy's gaze. That night, Arthur sat alone in his father's study, surrounded by stacks of yellowed ledgers and overdue bills. The grandfather clock ticked heavily in the corner, marking the passage of time in a house that felt suddenly vast and empty. He placed his palms flat on the oak desk, feeling the deep scratches left by his father's pen. He didn't pray, he didn't mourn. Instead, he pulled a fresh ledger from the drawer, opened to the first page, and wrote 3 words at the top: the Vane estate. He was going to build an empire on this grave. The next 5 years were consumed by a relentless, grinding routine that blurred day into night. True to his word, Arthur worked 14-hour shifts at the Cedar Falls rendering plant, a foul, steaming facility where livestock offal was processed into industrial fat. He returned home at dawn, his clothing soaked in grease and the iron stench of blood, only to climb straight onto his father's old John Deere tractor to turn the fields before the midday heat set in. His sleep was reduced to stolen 3-hour snatches on the kitchen bench, while his mother kept watch over the coffee pot. He was a man possessed, driven not by love for the hearth, but by an insatiable hunger for scale. While other farmers in Blackwood County relied on traditional methods and modest yields, Arthur poured every cent he earned into chemical fertilizers, mechanized irrigation, and high-yield hybrid seed. He saw the future of farming not as a family craft, but as an industrial machine, and he was determined to be its master. By 1974, the gamble began to pay off. A global grain shortage pushed corn and soybean prices to unprecedented heights. While his neighbors used their windfall profits to pay off old personal debts or build new homes, Arthur bought out small, struggling homesteads whose owners were exhausted by the brutal work. First came the Miller parcel along the creek, then the Miller family's pasture, and finally the 90 acres owned by old Thomas Vance, who died without an heir. With every deed he signed, Arthur felt a dark, addictive thrill. The bank that had once patronized him now opened its double doors with eager handshakes. Yet this rapid expansion required more than just hard work. It demanded sacrifice. In the spring of 1977, Arthur married Eleanor Vance, a quiet, sharp-minded schoolteacher from the next town over. It was not a grand romance born of passion. It was a pragmatic union, forged in shared isolation. Eleanor saw in Arthur a man of unstoppable force, a rock against the unpredictable storms of Midwestern life. Arthur saw in Eleanor a woman capable of keeping order in a home that was fast becoming the nerve center of a massive commercial operation. Together, they built a new house on the highest rise of the property. It was a tall, sharp-angled structure of dark cedar and slate, towering over the modest whitewashed farmhouses of the valley like a sentinel. "It's too big, Arthur," Eleanor whispered softly on the night they moved in, looking out from the master bedroom balcony at the dark sea of corn rustling in the night wind. "It feels lonely." "It's small compared to what's coming," Arthur replied, his arm wrapped around her waist, though his eyes were fixed on the distant yellow lights of the neighboring Miller farm. "We need room to grow, room for the boy." Their son, Samuel, was born a year later during the hottest summer on record. From the moment he could walk, Samuel was steeped in his father's obsession. While other children in Blackwood County played baseball or swam in the quarry, Samuel was taught how to read soil reports, calculate grain futures, and repair heavy hydraulic machinery. Arthur treated his son not with cruelty, but with an agonizing, demanding gravity. He expected absolute perfection. "Look at that dirt, Sam," Arthur would say, kneeling in the center of a 2,000-acre plot as the sun dipped low and crimson. He would grab a fistful of dark soil and press it into his 6-year-old son's tiny palm. "This isn't just mud, this is capital. Every grain of this earth belongs to us because we worked harder, thought faster, and bled more than anyone else. Don't ever let anyone take a foot of it." Samuel looked at his father with a mixture of reverence and terrifying awe. To the boy, Arthur Vane was not just a father. He was a god who commanded the weather, the earth, and the men who worked it. By the early 1980s, the American farm crisis erupted. High interest rates, falling crop prices, and a Soviet grain embargo crushed the agricultural heartland. Across Iowa and Illinois, red auction flags fluttered in the wind like signal fires of defeat. Families who had held their land for generations were stripped of everything in a matter of hours. Their tractors and homes sold off on county courthouse steps for pennies on the dollar. Where others saw tragedy, Arthur saw opportunity. While his neighbors begged the banks for extensions, Arthur walked into the Blackwood National Bank with a briefcase full of immaculate financial records and cash reserves he had hoarded through years of miserly living. He didn't just survive the crisis, he fed on it. One evening in November 1982, Arthur sat in the parlor of his neighbor, Jack Miller, the son of the old banker who had once threatened to foreclose on Silas Vane. Jack was sitting across from him, his hands trembling as he held a half-empty glass of cheap whiskey. On the coffee table between them lay the deed to the 300-acre Miller farm. "You don't have to do this, Arthur," Jack said, his voice cracking with shame and rage. "We've been neighbors for 30 years. My father gave your father credit when nobody else would. Your father tried to ruin my family when my father was 6 feet in the ground," Arthur said, his voice as cold as ice on a stock tank. "And I'm not doing anything, Jack. The market did this. You took out loans you couldn't cover for equipment you couldn't afford. Now the bank owns you." "And you bought the bank's note," Jack snarled, leaning forward. "You bought my life for 70 cents on the dollar." "I bought land that was being wasted," Arthur corrected him quietly, standing up and buttoning his coat. "Sign the paper, Jack. I'll give you enough cash to get your family to Des Moines and start over. Stay here, and the sheriff puts your furniture on the lawn by Friday." Jack stared at Arthur with pure, burning hatred, but his hand trembled as he took the pen and signed his name at the bottom of the document. As Arthur walked out into the cold night, holding the signed deed, he looked back at the darkened Miller house. For a brief second, he saw the ghost of his father standing by the broken fence line, his eyes filled with sorrow. Arthur hardened his heart, stepped into his truck, and drove back toward his modern empire. He was winning the war against the land, but the price of every acre was being carved straight out of his soul. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Vane enterprise was no longer just a farm. It was an agricultural titan. The sagging red barn of Silas Vane's era had long been demolished, replaced by a sprawling industrial complex of gleaming steel silos, climate-controlled seed facilities, and a fleet of massive satellite-guided harvesters that roamed the county like mechanical leviathans. Arthur Vane was now in his early 50s. The work had not bent his spine as it had his father's. Instead, it had petrified him. His hair was iron gray, his skin weathered like tanned leather, and his presence carried an oppressive, unyielding authority. In Blackwood County, his word was law. He owned nearly 12,000 acres of the richest soil in the state, 3 commercial grain elevators, and a controlling stake in the local equipment dealership. Yet inside the pristine, multi-story brick home on the hill, the silence was deafening. Eleanor had gradually withdrawn into a quiet, ghost-like existence. The house was spotless, filled with expensive furniture brought in from Chicago, but it lacked warmth. She watched her husband turn into a machine of pure logic and balance sheets, and worse, she watched him mold their son into his own image. Samuel was 22 now, a tall, intensely serious young man, with his father's sharp jawline and gray eyes. He had returned from the State Agricultural University with a degree in agronomy and business management, but he had not returned with joy. He carried the weight of the Vane name like an iron collar around his neck. "You're soft on the crew, Sam," Arthur said one scorching afternoon in August. They were standing at the edge of Field 42, a vast, 2,000-acre ocean of deep green corn humming with the sound of locusts. Arthur was staring down a young farmhand who was trying to explain why a combine hydraulic line had blown. "The seal failed because of factory defect, Dad," Samuel said, stepping between his father and the trembling 19-year-old worker. "It wasn't his fault. We ran the machine 18 hours yesterday in 90s heat." "Equipment doesn't fail unless it's neglected," Arthur snapped, his voice cutting through the humid air. He turned his cold gaze onto the young worker. "Pack your tools. Get your check from Eleanor. You're done." "Dad, wait," Samuel started, his face flushing red. "He's done," Arthur shouted, stepping directly into Samuel's space. The young worker scrambled away toward his truck, terrified. Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping into a dangerous, raspy murmur. "You think this empire runs on sympathy, Sam? You think the storm cares if a tractor hose breaks? The land demands discipline. If a man can't keep his machinery tight, he leaves a weakness in the wall. And I didn't spend 30 years building this wall just to let you let it fall apart." "It's not a wall, Dad," Samuel yelled back, a rare flash of rebellion bursting through his disciplined shell. "It's a farm, but you don't even see the crops anymore. You just see numbers. You look at this land like an enemy you have to keep under your boot." "And what if it is?" Arthur roared, his eyes widening with an unhinged, violent intensity that shocked Samuel into silence. "Look around you. Everything you touch, everything you eat, the clothes on your back, the college you went to. It was built because I put my boot on this dirt's neck before it killed us like it killed my father. You want to be soft? Go live in the city and write books. But if you're going to wear the Vane name, you hold the line." Samuel stood frozen, staring at his father. For the first time, he didn't see a god. He saw a terrified, obsessed old man trapped in a prison of his own making, terrified that if he stopped driving, the ghost of poverty would swallow him whole. Without another word, Samuel turned, climbed into his pickup truck, and sped away, leaving a cloud of thick, white limestone dust hanging in the stagnant air. That evening, the storm finally broke. It was not a normal summer rain, but a terrifying Midwestern squall, a black wall of cloud that swept out of the west, turning the sky an apocalyptic shade of bruised green. The wind howled through the steel silos, making them groan like dying beasts. Hail the size of golf balls began to hammer the aluminum roofs of the outbuildings. Inside the mansion, Eleanor sat in the darkened living room, listening to the glass rattle in the window frames. Arthur stood on the covered porch, staring out into the tempest with a dark, defiant scowl, a half-empty glass of scotch in his calloused hand. Suddenly, the front door burst open. Samuel rushed in, drenched to the skin, his eyes wide with panic. "The lower levee broke at the river," Samuel yelled over the roaring thunder. "The creek's overflowing into the south seed sheds. The new bioengineered seed shipments are in there. $2 million worth, Dad. If the water hits them, they're ruined." Arthur didn't hesitate. He tossed his glass into the yard where it shattered against the stone steps. "Get the heavy dozers. We're building the mud berm at the culvert." "It's too dangerous," Eleanor pleaded, running out into the hallway, her face white with fear. "Arthur, the radio says there are tornadic winds coming. Let the seed go. It's insured." "Insured doesn't plant crops in April," Arthur roared back over the storm. "Sam, get in the cab." For the next 3 hours, father and son fought the elements in a nightmare of mud, roaring diesel engines, and blinding rain. The headlights of the massive yellow bulldozers cut weak shafts of light through the downpour as they pushed tons of earth against the rising brown waters of the creek. Arthur worked like a demon, leaping into the freezing water to hook winch cables, his lungs screaming for air, his muscles tearing under the effort. He refused to give up an inch of his ground to the flood. He cursed the rain, he cursed the river, he cursed God himself. Then disaster struck. The embankment beneath the left track of Samuel's bulldozer gave way. The massive 50-ton machine began to tilt sideways, sliding down the slick clay slope into the roaring current of the swollen creek. "Sam, get out!" Arthur screamed, his voice swallowed by the thunder. Through the rain-streaked glass of the cab, Arthur saw his son struggling with the heavy metal door, which had jammed against the mud bank. The heavy machine rolled further, its exhaust stack sputtering black smoke as the engine drowned. "Dad!" Samuel's muffled scream echoed out over the roar of the water as the cab sank half-submerged into the raging river. Panic, pure and unadulterated, shattered the icy wall Arthur had built around his heart for 30 years. He didn't think about the seed. He didn't think about the acreage, the balance sheets, or the cold, bitter legacy of Silas Vane. All he saw was his boy's pale face pressed against the glass of the drowning cab, framed by the dark, churning waters of the creek. "Sam!" Arthur roared, plunging headlong into the freezing current. The torrent slammed into his chest like a running bull, dragging his feet out from under him. The current was thick with mud, broken branches, and lethal debris. Arthur fought against the pull, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the side of the half-submerged bulldozer, his fingers clawing at the slick, cold steel of the frame until his fingernails tore and bled. The cab was taking on water fast. Inside, Samuel was kicking violently at the reinforced glass of the side window, but the pressure of the mud and water outside held the door jammed shut. The river was threatening to flip the 50-ton machine entirely, which would pin Samuel under the dark water forever. Arthur hauled himself onto the tracks, his boots slipping on the slick metal. He grabbed a heavy steel tow hook hanging from the rear winch assembly. Fueled by an insane, terrifying surge of adrenaline, he swung the 20-pound iron hook with all his body weight directly into the driver's side window. Crack! The safety glass spiderwebbed into 1,000 white fractures. Arthur swung again, screaming at the top of his lungs, slamming the iron into the glass until it gave way, showering the interior with blunt crystals. Water surged through the opening. Arthur reached into the dark cab, his fingers locking onto the collar of Samuel's heavy canvas jacket. "Pull, Sam, pull!" Arthur screamed, his voice raw, tearing his own throat. With a desperate heave, Arthur dragged his son through the broken window frame. Jagged glass sliced open Arthur's forearm, but he felt no pain. He hauled Samuel onto the tilted body of the machine just as a massive surge of water swept over the engine block with a sickening metallic groan. Together, bruised, bleeding, and drenched in mud, they scrambled up the bank, dragging each other through the sucking clay until they collapsed onto the gravel drive above the flood line. Behind them, with a heavy sucking sound, the multi-ton bulldozer slipped completely into the creek bed, swallowed by the brown torrent. Arthur lay on his back in the mud, his chest heaving, rain hammering against his face. Next to him, Samuel was coughing violently, spitting out creek water, gasping for air. Slowly, Arthur rolled over on his side, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he grabbed his son's shoulders. "You breathin'? Sam, look at me. You breathin'?" Samuel nodded weakly, wiping blood and mud from his eyes. I'm okay, Dad. I'm okay." Arthur stared at his son for a long, frozen second. Then, for the first time in Samuel's life, Arthur collapsed forward, burying his face into his son's mud-stained shoulder, and wept. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was a deep, racking sob that tore through his chest, releasing decades of buried terror, grief, and cold, lonely rage. Samuel lay there on the cold gravel, shocked, his arms slowly rising to hold his father's shivering shoulders. The rain continued to pour, but the storm inside the Vane family had finally reached its terrible, quiet climax. The morning sun broke through the clouds in a brilliant, terrifying clear sky, casting a golden light over a scene of devastation. The seed sheds were ruined. Nearly $2 million in inventory lay under 6 inches of thick, toxic silt. The lower fields were completely submerged, looking less like a farm and more like an endless, muddy lake reflecting the empty blue sky. The monetary loss was staggering, a blow that would have crippled any other agricultural operation in North America. Bank representatives, insurance adjusters, and local news trucks began to arrive by midday, their tires crunching on the gravel drive of the Vane estate. Arthur sat at the big oak desk in his office, the same desk where he had written "The Vane Estate" in a fresh ledger 25 years earlier. His right arm was wrapped in heavy white bandages. His eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles of bone-deep exhaustion. Miller's successor at the bank, a younger man named Vance, sat across from him, looking over the damage assessments with a grim, tight expression. "It's a massive hit, Arthur," Vance said quietly, setting down his pen. "If we restructure the loan on the northern acreage and liquidate your equipment reserves, you can cover the loss, but you'll have to sell off the Miller parcel, the 300 acres by the river." Arthur stared at the paper. The Miller parcel. the land he had taken from Jack Miller during the dark days of 1982. The land he had fought for, bled for, and used to prove his absolute dominance over the county. 10 years ago, Arthur would have burned his own house down before giving up a single acre to a bank. Slowly, the door to the office opened. Samuel walked in, his arm in a sling, his face bruised. He stood beside his father's chair, not speaking, but looking down at the documents with a calm, unyielding presence. Arthur looked at his son, then he looked out the high, arched window at the sun drying the mud on the hills. "Sell it," Arthur said softly. Vance blinked, astonished. "Arthur, you want to sell?" "Sell the Miller parcel," Arthur repeated, his voice flat, but free of the old bitterness. "Offer it back to Jack Miller's son first, at market price. Use the proceeds to pay off the bank." "Dad," Samuel whispered, looking down at his father in quiet disbelief. Arthur reached out with his uninjured hand and laid it over Samuel's wrist. His grip was still strong, but the old suffocating tension was gone. "The land doesn't belong to me, Sam," Arthur said softly, his gray eyes looking through the window at the endless horizon of Blackwood County. "It never did. We just borrow it for a little while, until it takes us back. I forgot that for a long time. My father forgot it too." He picked up his pen, signed the authorization forms, and pushed them across the desk to the banker. "Get out of my house, Vance," Arthur said calmly. "We have work to do." The years that followed the Great Flood of 1993 did not bring the downfall of the Vane estate. Instead, they marked its transformation. The sale of the Miller parcel paid off the immediate debts, but the fundamental structure of the operation changed forever. The cold, mechanical obsession that had driven Arthur for nearly 4 decades softened into a quieter, more calculated wisdom. For the first time in his life, Arthur began to relinquish control, handing the daily management of the farm over to Samuel. Where Arthur had ruled by fear and brute force, Samuel led with intelligence and modern vision. He diversified the crops, transitioning vast sections of the land away from high-risk monoculture toward sustainable crop rotations and organic high-yield grain. He built better housing for the seasonal workers, raised their wages, and established a safety protocol that ended the ruthless sweatshop atmosphere Arthur had maintained for decades. Yet Arthur was far from absent. He didn't retire to a coastal town or sit passively on the front porch with a glass of whiskey. Every morning at 5 o'clock, his weathered figure could be seen standing on the gravel rise behind the main house, watching the massive green harvesters roll out into the fields like an army returning to duty. But his eyes were no longer dark with hatred for the soil. He looked at the earth with the quiet respect of a man who had survived a war with an honorable enemy. In the autumn of 2008, 30 years after the birth of his son, Arthur celebrated his 70th birthday. The Vane estate had grown to encompass over 15,000 acres, not through predatory foreclosures, but through successful partnerships, sustainable yields, and an unblemished reputation for fair dealing. The farm was widely recognized as one of the most technologically advanced and profitable agricultural enterprises in the entire American Midwest. The red barn of Silas Vane was long gone, but in its place stood a slate and timber pavilion that housed the family's history. Original photos of Silas standing beside his scrawny draft horses, the yellowed ledgers from the Great Depression, and the framed deed of the original 40 acres that Arthur had bled to save. On the night of his birthday, a grand feast was held in the pavilion. Over 200 people attended, local farmers, business partners, family friends, and workers whose families had been on the Vane payroll for 3 generations. Even Jack Miller's grandson, who now owned a prosperous organic dairy farm on the reclaimed Miller land, sat at the head table, clinking glasses with Samuel. Eleanor, her hair now a soft silver, sat beside Arthur, holding his calloused hand under the linen tablecloth. For the first time in memory, her face was completely free of the ghost-like anxiety that had defined her youth. The house on the hill was no longer a cold fortress. It was filled with the laughter of Samuel's 3 children, who ran through the tall halls with the same frantic energy Arthur had possessed as a boy. As the music faded and the guests began to disperse into the crisp, starry October night, Samuel walked out to the edge of the dark garden where his father stood alone, staring out over the vast, dark ocean of harvested fields. "You should come inside, Dad," Samuel said gently, draping a warm wool coat over Arthur's shoulders. "The chill's coming off the river." Arthur didn't move immediately. He pulled the coat around himself, inhaling the familiar sharp scent of autumn night air, wood smoke, damp earth, and dry husks of corn. "Look at that line down by the creek, Sam," Arthur said quietly, pointing a long, spotted finger toward the dark silhouette of the timberline. "Your grandfather used to sit right there on an old tractor tire when he thought the world was ending. He thought the earth was a curse." "And what do you think it is?" Samuel asked softly, leaning against the fence rail beside his father. Arthur was silent for a long moment. He looked down at his right arm, the pale, jagged scar from the bulldozer window still visible beneath his cuff. He thought of his father's unmarked grave, the scent of the rendering plant, the cold eyes of Banker Miller, and the terrifying roar of the floodwater that had nearly swallowed his only child. "It's not a curse," Arthur said, his voice deep, raspy, and full of an unshakable peace. "And it's not an enemy. It's just a mirror, Sam. It gives you back exactly what you put into it. If you bring it hatred and greed, it'll starve your soul until you're nothing but dust. But if you bring it sweat, discipline, and love, it'll feed your family forever." He turned to his son, placing his heavy hand on Samuel's shoulder. The grip was old, the skin paper-thin over knobby knuckles, but the warmth inside it was absolute. "You built a better farm than I did, Sam," Arthur whispered. "My father broke his back trying to keep the land. I broke my heart trying to own it. But you learned how to live with it." Samuel felt a sudden, thick knot rise in his throat. He covered his father's hand with his own. "I only knew where to walk because you cleared the road, Dad." Arthur smiled, a rare, brilliant flash that reached his gray eyes and softened every deep line carved into his face. He looked out one last time at the dark silvered fields stretching under the vast Midwestern sky, vast and rich and quiet. "The road's clear now," Arthur said softly. "Let's go home." Father and son turned away from the edge of the field and walked back up the hill together toward the warm, glowing lights of the house, leaving the land to rest under the quiet sky, ready for another spring.